All right, so you probably think of the law as this rigid, unchanging thing, right? Like it's all written in stone. But what if a decision from way back when just feels, well, wrong today or totally outdated? That's what we're digging into here, how the law actually has this incredible ability to change its mind.
You know, this is a pretty cynical take, right? Jonathan Swift, writing more than 300 years ago, basically saw legal precedent as a trap. He thought it was just a way for the system to keep making the same mistakes over and over again, just because that's how it's always been done. And honestly, he kind of hits on the central problem, doesn't he? When does following the past stop being about stability and start getting in the way of actual justice?
And that brings us to the heart of the debate, which you can see perfectly in these two quotes. On one side, you've got Lord Denning, who's basically saying, look, if we're heading for a cliff, we don't have to keep walking just because that's the path we started on. But then you have Justice Brandeis on the other side, making a really powerful point. It's often more important for the law to be predictable and settled than for it to be perfect. People need to know the rules of the game. So, do we want the right law or a certain law? That's the big question.
Okay, so let's get into the problem with precedent itself. It all boils down to one simple but really powerful legal concept.
And that concept has a fancy Latin name, stare decisis. All it really means is to stand by things decided. It's the bedrock of our legal system, the thing that gives it stability and makes it predictable. But you can see the issue, right? If you stand by everything that's already been decided, what happens when society moves on and those old decisions just don't fit anymore?
So how does this all work in practice? How does the system make sure everyone stands by those decisions? Well, it's not just one big rule. It's actually a pretty clever two-part system that's all about hierarchy.
Okay, think of it like this. First, you've got vertical precedent. This is the top-down ironclad rule. If you're a lower court, you must follow what the higher courts say. No ifs, ands, or buts. It's non-negotiable. Then you've got horizontal precedent. This is where a court looks sideways at its own previous decisions. Now, it should follow them for consistency's sake, but it's not absolutely locked in. And that's where things get interesting. That's where we start to see a little bit of flexibility.
So even within these strict-sounding rules, there are ways for judges and lawyers to maneuver. It's not about breaking the law, it's about finding the, let's call them, loopholes.
To get how they do this, you got to understand that not every word in a judge's decision is created equal. You have the ratio decidendi. That's the core reason, the actual rule that decided the case. That's the part that's binding. But then you have all the other stuff the judge might say, their side comments, their thoughts, maybe some what-if scenarios. That's called obiter dicta, which basically means other stuff that was said. It's not the law, but it can be really persuasive.
And this is a great point from Justice Binney of Canada's Supreme Court. All obiter is not created equal. Yeah, technically those side comments aren't binding, but when the highest court in the land makes a comment that's clearly meant as guidance for everyone else, you'd better listen. As he said, you'd be pretty foolish to just ignore it.
This leads us to the #1 tool in any lawyer's toolkit when they're faced with a precedent they don't like. It's called distinguishing. It's pretty simple, really. You look at the old case, you look at your new case, and you argue, hey, the key facts here are just too different. That old rule, it doesn't fit. It's a real art form, and it's how the law inches forward one case at a time.
But sometimes, just distinguishing a case isn't going to cut it. Sometimes you need something more drastic. And that brings us to the legal equivalent of a blockbuster move, when a court overrules itself. We're not talking about bending the rules anymore. We're talking about a court looking at one of its own decisions from the past and flat out saying, you know what? We were wrong.
Believe it or not, this idea of a court overruling itself is pretty new. For ages, the highest court in the UK, which was a huge influence on Canadian law, thought its decisions were final, like forever. Only Parliament could change them. But then in 1966, they had a change of heart. They realized that being too rigid could actually lead to injustice, and that thinking spread. In Canada, when the Charter of Rights and Freedoms came along in 1982, it was a huge game changer, giving courts a new reason to look back at old decisions and see if they still held up.
And a perfect example is the case of R versus Henry. The Supreme Court looked back at a decision it had made 19 years earlier and basically said, yeah, this isn't working. For almost 2 decades, they'd seen how the old rules on self-incrimination were causing problems, that they were just unworkable. They decided it was better to admit they'd made a mistake than to stick with a bad rule that wasn't lining up with the charter.
So, where does that leave us today? Well, it's not about just throwing out old rules whenever we feel like it, but it's also not about blindly following the past. It's all about finding a balance.
When a top court thinks about taking that huge step of overruling itself, it's not just a gut feeling. They go through something like a mental checklist. They ask themselves a bunch of really important questions, like, does this old precedent even make sense with our modern values, especially with the Charter? Has this rule actually worked out in the real world, or has it just been a mess? A big one is, if we change this, are we going to mess up a bunch of contracts or property deals that people have relied on? And they also look at how old the precedent is. Sometimes it's just better to fix a mistake early before it gets too tangled up in the system.
So let's circle back to where we started. We had this fear, right, that precedent could just lock us into the mistakes of the past. But what we've seen is a system that actually has ways to evolve, to adapt, and even to completely change course. So I'll leave you with this question. Is a legal system that can admit it got something wrong a sign of weakness? Or is that flexibility its greatest strength?